Quest, Part 1. Written and read by Claudette Evans. Christopher Maxim stared blankly at the clean sheet of A4 lined pad on the mahogany writing desk, the fingers of his right hand twirling the soft leaded pencil. His mind as devoid of ideas as the page before him. Following his 2 earlier runaway successes, he'd already sold the pitch. Facing a tricky and challenging patch in his life, writer Marshall Warren decides to take his wife and 2 teenage children on a short break to a secluded country resort. However, all is not as peaceful as it first appears, especially when the family discover an abandoned church. However, that was as far as they'd got, and the clock was ticking. "Chris!" a voice shouted from the open doorway. "Come on, we want to get there before dusk." By the sharp tone and rapid dialogue, he could visualize his wife standing with biting lip and tapping foot by the open front door. "I'm just coming," he called back, sighing as he closed the A4 pad, sliding it into the pocket of his weekend case. November the 1st was their 15th wedding anniversary, and he'd been hoping for a romantic weekend in Devon and a visit to the Dartington Crystal Factory to buy something special, something to mark the occasion. So he wasn't exactly delighted when Eleanor insisted their 2 children and Scamp the dog accompanied them. With Josh and Katrina absorbed on their iPads and Eleanor immersed checking her emails on her iPhone, the journey was spent in silence, apart from the Jack Russell's high-pitched barking at every passing motorbike. Arriving at the remote Forest Lodge site, having almost missed the sign, the owner at once recognized Chris, much to the annoyance of Eleanor. "So much for out of season, exclusive and quiet. I suppose that means we're going to be pestered all week," she grumbled as they made their way to the log cabin set deep in the ancient woods. "Wow, Dad!" exclaimed Josh, seeing the e-bikes standing outside their accommodation. "These are real cool. Can Trina and I go for a cycle? Please?" "Sure, and take Scamp with you. Your mother and I can unpack," said Chris, taking hold of the 2 backpacks thrust upon him by the eager children and placing his one free arm around his wife's shoulder, adding, "Well, Josh seems happy." She shrugged his hand from her body. "If you hadn't given in to them over having a dog, we'd be checking into a charming hotel instead of this. I was lucky to find somewhere open that would take pets," he replied, "and kids." Inside, the Pine Lodge was one large, all-open plan space, with 2 leather sofas either side of the log fire burning in the hearth. There were 4 doors leading off to the 3 bedrooms and a family bathroom. "Rather cosy," said Chris, depositing the bags on the hand-woven multicolored carpet. Eleanor's mood softened upon seeing the 2 vases of red roses and bottle of Moet and Chandon champagne, which Chris immediately opened, suggesting they enjoyed a toast. "Here's to the next 15 years. "I'm sorry," said Eleanor. "It's tough. You never seem to have any time for us, and with Josh having problems settling at his new school." Chris was about to speak, but she held a finger to his lips, preventing him. "I know," she continued. "You scriptwriters have a deadline to meet, and we wouldn't be where we are without your books and films. Sometimes I just wish it didn't take so much of you." He knew when to stay silent, and this was one of those moments. So instead he took her in his arms and kissed her. Easily and hungrily they moved to the bedroom, shedding garments along the way, her spontaneous arousal taking him by surprise. Their lovemaking was sensuous and frantic. It was the first time in months. Afterwards, Eleanor seemed more relaxed. Her mood brightened further upon the return of the teenagers, with stories of a ruined church and a very muddy scamp, who, before anyone could stop him, had shaken most of it onto the surrounding walls and furniture. Perhaps the champagne was having an effect, but even Eleanor found this amusing. After an improvised dinner made from the provisions they'd brought with them, the four took advantage of the golden sunset for a walk around the park, the fiery reds casting a rich hue on the surrounding forest. "We appear to have the place to ourselves," observed Eleanor. "No internet either," moaned Katrina. "Now, won't that be nice?" replied her mother, raising her eyebrows and casting a knowing smile at her husband. "And your father can enjoy some downtime." And as a thin layer of mist masked the full moon, they returned to the lodge, the teens still grumbling about the lack of internet, the adults to indulge in a single malt before turning in for the night. Fetching more wood for the fire, Chris hunched his shoulders against the early morning cool, damp air. Looking up to the clear blue sky, he prayed this break would give him the inspiration he desperately needed, having always considered writer's block to be a myth. Having promised to be the warmest of the week, Eleanor announced she was taking her daughter to visit the local town for some girly time, having primed her husband to have a man-to-man chat with their son. "Give you a chance to explore the ruins," she said, adding, "but please don't let Scamp roll in anything." "Oh, the fox poo," yelled Josh, picking up the terrier. "All the best dogs are wearing it," rubbing his nose into the dog's coat. "You're gross," retorted his sister, as Scamp wiggled free, shaking himself from head to tail. Waving the girls bon voyage, Chris, Josh, and Scamp left the cabin behind to make their way to the abandoned church. Reaching the clearing in the woods, Chris exclaimed, "I thought you said it was a ruin. It just looks abandoned and neglected to me." "There's a way in," cried Josh, triumphantly grabbing his father's hand and dragging him around to the back of the grey stone, ivy-clad, dilapidated building. Ripped from its hinges, the steel security door lay discarded in the long grass, leaving the ancient wooden door ajar. Squeezing through, Chris said, "Looks like they left in a hurry. There's still books of prayer open on the pews," and brushing aside the multitude of cobwebs as he began to explore. "Did you notice how cold it was in here yesterday?" asked Chris. His son was at the age of short sentences, formed primarily of grunts and moans, yet young enough to wish to spend time with his father. So Chris was unfazed when there was no answer, and continued looking around for clues as to the history and sudden demise of the building. It wasn't until his tummy rumbled, telling him it was time to leave, he discovered Josh had disappeared. Chris began frantically calling both boy and dog's name, first softly, then with increasingly enforced anger, but to no avail. A cold sweat broke out across his brow, and he felt his pulse quicken. Then he heard Scamp barking, quickly coming into view, followed by Josh. "Didn't you hear me calling?" cried Chris, more in relief than anger. "Come on, Dad, you won't believe what I found," cried Josh. His father hadn't seen his son this animated for a long time, and smiled as the boy explained he'd found a secret stairway in the vestry leading to a bell tower. "Except it isn't a belfry. It's a library of sorts. Lots of old dusty books and papers and," said Josh as they climbed the narrow, cobwebbed stairwell. "And this," pointing to a pentagram filling the central area. Chris bent down and ran his fingers over the crudely drawn, white five-pointed star. "This looks fresh," he said, rubbing the chalk between his fingers. "Hey, look at this," yelled Josh, pulling a leather-bound book from one of the shelves. "It's a diary of sorts. See, it's dated." On the front was a crudely burnt date, 1646. "It can't be diaries," Diaries weren't fashionable until 100 years later. Someone's having us on, replied his father. It's full of Latin incantations. Go on, Dad, read one out. Clearing his throat, Chris began to chant in a deep voice. No hinc omnis spiritus invoco. What's that mean, Dad? Something about invoking a spirit, I think, he replied, as the skies darkened and a swirling mist enveloped the room, accompanied by chanting. As the volume increased, Scamp let out a high-pitched yelp and, with tail tucked between his legs, ran as though the devil himself was chasing him. Come on, Josh. I think it's time we got out of here, roared Chris, grabbing hold of his son's arm. It was getting dark as mother and daughter returned from their shopping trip, and was surprised to find Scamp lying on the decking, whining. Where'd they got to? Asked Katrina, scratching the dog's ear. Oh, you know your father, probably lost in the woods, replied her mother. They'll be back in time for dinner. When they hadn't returned an hour later, Eleanor phoned the police, who were a little help, asking her to phone again in the morning. 24 hours later, a full manhunt was underway. It was called off after 10 days, despite endless appeals. No trace of either Chris or Josh was found. It was as though they had simply vanished into thin air.